Welcome, everyone, to the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina. This is Working Through It Wednesday with Bob Stevens and Margaret Merriweather. They're here to talk to us a little bit more about tips and PDSA and a crosswalk between the two. Bob is a consultant with many different grants around our area for Bass, Coin, and Aware, as well as PCORI. And then we have Margaret, who is the Director of Student Mental Health with the Department of Mental Health. So they are both well versed in their ability to share some resources with us. And I'm going to turn it over to them. Just a reminder to complete the 5-question survey at the end so that we can be sure to continue to provide professional development that is relevant to all of you watching. So thank you so much, Bob and Margaret, for being here. And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Getting our screen share. There we go. Hello, everyone. This is Bob Stevens. And let me see if we can get this started. Okay. From the beginning. Okay. I think we have the slide there, right? Taylor, is that correct? We got it up?
You are correct.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. As you know, this is part three of a 3-part session. And we're talking about planning documents for school teams. And what Margaret and I are very interested in doing is helping school teams do a good job with planning and data problem solving so they can move the initiatives, the behavioral health initiatives within their schools forward. 2 really big initiatives have developed approaches for doing team planning and team problem solving. The first one is the PBIS initiative out of the University of Oregon, the PBIS TA Center. And the second is the Center for School Mental Health out of the University of Maryland. So Margaret and I are going to, Margaret and I have already done a brief overview of these 2 approaches, and now we're going to compare the 2 a little bit. Okay, so we know that our planning process for school teams has been developed in 2 locations. The first one, the National Center for School Mental Health at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and they use an approach called Plan, Do, Study, Act, PDSA. And Margaret has given us a quick overview of that. The Technical Assistance Center on PBIS at the University of Oregon has come up with an approach that they call Team Implemented Problem Solving, or TIPS. So we're going to be using those acronyms for the rest of this approach, PDSA and TIPS, and we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between the 2. I went over a little bit about the TIPS process earlier as well. So we've had the summary on both of these, and now we're going to compare the 2. Anytime I come out of PBIS, of course, and so anytime I have a presentation, I always make sure that I have my meeting expectations. And although this is recorded and our expectations are critical, I like to have people do as I say and also do as I do, which is always to start out any meeting, any class with a set of expectations. So I've done that. I've done my due diligence there. When Margaret talked to us about PDSAs, she explained to us that PDSAs, or Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles, are small repeated tests of change that school and district teams can pilot during quality improvement process. Remember, this is for our school team. This is for our MTSS team or our Tier 2 team. It can be used for any number of teams. District teams can use this as well. And what a PDSA is designed to do is to help us pilot quality improvements. And this whole idea of the quality improvement process is a very important one for both TIPS and PDSAs. TIPS, or Team Initiated Problem Solving, is a model for supporting school MTSS teams to implement an effective meeting process and also to use database decision-making to guide the problem solving that they do. So this is a summary of the 2. We've had a review of them. And so let's talk about a little bit in more detail some of the crosswalks here. The PDSO overview, and I'll ask Margaret if she wants to jump in here and talk about it. If you look at these circles over on the side, you see the circles being rotating, and because what occurs is we have a very small effort to develop a change. We try that change, we implement the change, and then we come back and we see, okay, how did that work? Did it improve? What's the next little change that we can do? And it becomes a small step, a small bite of process where we improve something, and eventually when we add these multiple cycles on top of each other, we end up with a larger change that ends up having some real improvement. And so that's a graphic of the multiple PDSA cycles, but do look at those circles and you see the way they rotate, because that's an important point. Margaret, I don't know if you want to add something there.
Yes, I also wanted to point out the y-axis, confidence that change is effective, and so that increase in confidence about the change over time.
Okay. If we look at the tip cycle, here we see the very sort of classic TQM. We identify the problem, we identify the goal for a change, we come up with our solution. And in the case of tips, we have a very specific data approach that we apply. We implement that solution very much like the PDSA, and we monitor the impact. And then we go back and we say, okay, did it work? Did it not work? How do we have to change it? Very much like the other one. So the process, this TQM process, again, the circles are turning, and it's these two things are very similar. The key with tips is they make a much bigger emphasis on data at being at the center here in the meeting of the middle of the thing. So here we see the PDSA overview, the tips overview, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the two and how the two work together. So let's crosswalk a bit between tips and PDSAs. From tips, and I love this graphic, this poor lady. People aren't tired from solving problems; they're tired from solving the same problem over and over again. And when we talk about tips, you're in our school team meetings, we're in our district team meetings, and it seems like we have the same problems this year that we had last year, and nothing is really changing. We try to address something, and nothing occurs. And what tips tells us is we have to put this plan together to move forward to have real change occur. So I love this idea. This is sort of the driver between the idea of tips. And the other idea here is that, and I mentioned this in the overview of tips, that we really want to move to a solution, but to do that, we really have to consider and use data. And if we don't use data to focus ourselves, then what will occur is we will end up with a meeting that wanders all over the place. And we have our hour-long meeting, and we talk about all the different problems, and we do a lot of finger pointing and complaining. And by the end of the meeting, we just run out of time and we never get to the solution. So one of the things that tips tells us is to use data to really focus what we're trying to do and to come up with that solution. So the other thing that tips tells us, and this is true for both tips and PDSAs, is that the key to collective problem solving is to provide a visual context that allows everyone to follow and contribute. I'm going to show you that in just a minute. So remember this idea that we have a visual context that everybody on our team can look at, can see, and so we know exactly what the plan is and exactly where we're going. We're going to come back to this when we talk, after we talk about PDSAs for a little bit. Now, within PDSAs, and Margaret will, in her conversation, talked a lot about this, the PDSAs tend to be much smaller steps, and the idea being like the frog on the lily pad, rather than try to jump all the way across the whole pond, you jump from one lily pad to the next lily pad to the next lily pad. And of course, the Chinese proverb there is a great leap forward often ends up with a stumble backward. So we want to take small little steps in the right direction. And the reason why PDSAs say that we want to do this is because anytime we're working with a school team, we have to be very careful about the implementations, the interventions or changes that we make. We know that schools are dynamic places, and you only have so many times to try to improve them before people give up on it. So what you want to do is have very small tests that make minor changes down there in the bottom left, because if you try to implement some major change, some major intervention, and it causes people to make a lot of changes and have to do a lot of work, and then it doesn't work, people are going to give up and they're going to walk away and they're going to say, this doesn't work, we don't want anything to do with it. So the idea with PDSAs is to do very small things, because if something doesn't go well and it's minor and small down in the bottom left, it doesn't create resistance to change that a major disaster zone where a large change was attempted and fails occurs. So we want to get to the major changes, the large changes, by taking small little minor and small bites. Okay. I talked earlier about having a graphic about what this specifically looks like. And I want to take a few minutes to look at the two different forms, because you're going to see some real similarities between the two. The first one we're looking here is TIPS form. And these forms are available to you. They'll be available in the Basque Library. So we're going to look at them here, but you can pick up Word versions of them so that you can actually type on the forms. When I'm having meetings, when I'm having team meetings in a school or a district, I like to actually take the form, put it on a computer, and put it on a projector, and during the meeting, as we're coming up with solutions, to use the form and type it so everybody can see who's doing what. In TIPS, we're very specific about our meetings, who's facilitating the meetings, who's taking the notes, who's looking at the data. We're very careful about what team members are present. We're very specific about having an agenda. We don't allow ourselves to wander all over. You'll notice that there's a spot here for the next meeting, because quite often discussion that we have at the meeting today will help us come up with our next meeting agenda, because they'll have issues that perhaps we want to address. As we are moving forward with TIPS, and again, we've had this review, but we have information that the team looks at and what we're trying to address. And if you'll notice over here on the side, we see who and by when. This TIPS form and all sort of problem-solving approaches that teams use always have to identify who's going to do what they're going to do, and when is it going to be done by. And so when we come up with our action plan, and if we look down under the problem-solving action plan piece, we look at the data, and in TIPS, we're always looking at who, what, where, when, and why, the data of that kind of data. What have we decided we're going to do about it? Who's going to do it? Who is going to do the activity? When is it going to be done by? And then what does success look like? What is our goal? Are we trying to reduce office referrals? Are we trying to improve interventions at tier 2 level? Whatever our goal is, we have a specific goal, so we know what it looks like. And then finally, at the bottom of the TIPS form, we see this very important rating that everybody gives us. How did we feel about this meeting? Did we accomplish what we wanted to? Was our overall rating good use of our time? Yes or no? And so it really allows us to come back and say, this worked well. So this TIPS form really guides our entire meeting. It becomes essentially the minutes of the meeting. So you don't have to take minutes. You can use this form as minutes. And it really makes life very easy. Let's take a look at the PDSA form and see what this looks like. And again, I'll ask Margaret to jump in here, because she's our PDSA person. But amazingly, what do you see? You see, what are the things that we want to do? What is our plan? What do we want to do? Who's going to be responsible for doing it? When is it going to be done by? How do we know that that we were successful? So again, Margaret, if you want to jump in, but if you look at this form, it is so very much like the other one that it's amazing. So and here, if we look down at the very bottom right-hand side where we act, we make a decision. Is this a good change? So we're going to keep doing it? Are we going to abandon it? Are we going to adapt it and somehow change it a little bit? Or are we going to adopt it? So you can see these two forms have a lot of similarities. I like the plan study and act form. It has a little circle up there on the top right, which reminds us that this is a total quality improvement process, but they all have very much the same components. Margaret? Oh, you muted yourself rather than unmute. I'm sorry. I'll give you a chance to unmute. Okay. Well,
Okay, thank you. Yes.
sure. So,
Thank you for pointing out that plan, do, study, and act, all the steps are on this worksheet. And it does get really specific on the who, what, when, where, and abandon, adapt, and adopt.
but we can certainly see similarities between these two forms, and both forms have their advantages and disadvantages. So, you know, one of the reasons we're showing this comparison is so we can take a look at them. Okay, we've seen the forms that we use. You remember earlier I said that it was important to be able to look at these forms, give people a visual context, and I think both these forms do this. And again, the forms are available in the Basque Library. Let's talk a little bit about the two approaches now, TIPS and PDSAs. They both have very specific activities and interventions that need to be implemented. The plan calls for an intervention for something to occur, specific actions to be taken. There's a time for these actions to be completed. Who will do what is an important part of both of these processes. In both cases, we do have some kind of data that we're going to collect, some kind of goal, decision, and this specific data will tell us when we want to do the results, what has to occur, and then helps us make a decision about whether or not we accomplished what we wanted to. Both of these approaches also have an idea that we cycle back around what worked, what didn't work, what do we need to change? So what modifications do we need to make to implement this more successfully? And it's very unusual in both PDSA and TIPS not to have some modification. Things never get implemented exactly the way they think they will. So it's perfectly appropriate to circle back around and have a change. In fact, one of the big problems that we have, and we see this in TIPS because TIPS usually is larger kind of changes, people will sometimes make the decision, they'll come up with their TIPS plan or the PDSA plan, and then they'll implement them and they'll just continue doing that way. And they don't stop to go back and see the progress monitor to see it's working. It's an important piece of this. And then, as I said earlier, the important point, both of these forms provide us a visual context that allows all the team members to follow and contribute. And that's critical here. All right, let's look at some of the other similars and also some differences between the two. We know that TIPS action plans tend to be in longer cycles. We know that PDSAs should be completed in 1 week. TIPS has a very formal who, what, where, when, and why data process, where PDSAs, they do look at data, but they don't have quite as formal a process by which specific data is looked at. You're asked to look at data, but it's left more up to the team itself. PDSAs are like stacking blocks. Each one builds on the previous one. The PDSA is smaller bites. You build 1, 2, 3 until a bigger change occurs. TIPS process can build on each other, but they also can stand alone as a planning activity. Both TIPS and PDSAs have a method to show that the desired improvement has occurred. We have an outcome under both TIPS and PDSAs, and that's a critical part, because if we don't have the outcome, we don't have a goal, we don't know whether we are successful. And I'd like to remind everyone that both TIPS and PDSAs are generic problem-solving processes that can be used when discussing academic, behavior, physical health, mental health, issues across all tiers in a school. These are problem-solving approaches that can be applied in many instances, not just behavioral health, although we're obviously addressing it here for behavioral health issues. Okay, so those are some of the similarities and differences. I like to think that teams would perhaps use TIPS at times, perhaps would use PDSAs. I think it's perfectly appropriate to use the smaller PDSA to help build and help gain information to perhaps go into a larger TIPS kind of process. But these two can work together. There's no reason that we can't in our team use both approaches, the positives from each one. But the important thing here is whether you like the TIPS approach or the PDSA approach, your school team must use a planning cycle approach. Otherwise, you're not going to make the progress that you can. So take a look at both of these, pick the one that works best or come up with a hybrid model, but absolutely do the planning using the concepts that are promoted by both TIPS and PDSAs. I want to thank everyone for being with us today. Here's my contact information and Dr. Merriweather's contact information. I would like to say we're going to follow up at some point with detailed trainings for both PDSAs and TIPS, and we're looking forward to that in the future. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Erin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob and Margaret. That was wonderful information for school teams and some great reminders, as well as the connectivity between the two tools and reminding us that that's exactly what they are. They're tools for our teams and our educators to use. And you just broke it down in a way that made it make sense to all of us. So thank you both so much for joining us with the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina. This has been Working Through It Wednesday, and we will see you next time.